Well, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here, and we see the group will continue to rise over the next couple of minutes. But as a way of welcome, we're very happy to have you. My name is Sister Colleen Gibson, and I'm a Sister of St. Joseph of Philadelphia. And tonight I'll be acting as a moderator for our webinar on women deacons featuring Dr. Phyllis Zagano. And a couple of notes before we begin. Our webinar tonight is being recorded, and in the next few days or the next week, a recording of it will be posted to Phyllis's website, so that you'll be able to access the entire recording and be able to revisit some of the bigger ideas that we're going to deal with. And tonight, our webinar is going to take part in two parts. The first part, Phyllis will offer us some input on women deacons, on recent occurrences, probably on the Synod, the Amazonian Synod. And then we'll move ourselves into a question and answer session. And some people have sent in questions via email to me. And some people, as you listen to Phyllis, questions may come up. And so I'd invite you to submit questions using the chat function on the Zoom call. So if you're on the computer, if you just hover your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little voice bubble with dots inside of it that says chat underneath it. And if you click this, you can send a message to the chat room. And I'll be working as a moderator and a curator of those questions. And so I'll go through and just kind of lead our conversation, taking the questions that we've already received and those that people send in throughout the course of the hour that we're together. And so if you have any questions, feel free to send them into the chat function. And if you run into any problems, you can't figure out how to use the chat function, you can feel free to email me at the email that was included in the confirmation for tonight. And I think that covers about everything. And so, like I said, we'll begin with some input from Phyllis, and then we'll have question and answer. And so by way of introduction of Phyllis and of the topic, just a little bit. So Dr. Phyllis Zagano is the Senior Research Associate in Residence and Adjunct Professor of Religion at Hofstra University. She is the author and editor of 23 books in religious studies, including Holy Saturday, an argument for the restoration of the female diaconate in the Catholic Church, published by Crossroads in 2000. Dr. Zagano's recent books include Women Deacons, Past, Present, Future, Women in Ministry, Emerging Questions of the Diaconate, Mysticism and the Spiritual Quest, Ordination of Women to the Diaconate in Eastern Churches, and Women Deacons, Essays with Answers. Her newest offering, Women, Icons of Christ, will appear in 2020 from Paulus Press. Her award-winning Just Catholic column runs monthly in the National Catholic Reporter and in other journals around the world. Her work has won numerous awards and has been translated around the world. As many of you know, in August of 2016, Pope Francis appointed her to the Papal Commission for the Study of Women in the Diaconate, which completed its report to the Pope at the end of 2018. And it's a great pleasure to be able to engage her in conversation on this important topic. And I really look forward to the conversation that we'll have. And so I'll hand it over to Phyllis and we'll be on our way.
Thanks, Colleen. I appreciate you all coming tonight, particularly since we're still recovering from daylight savings and it might be too late for all of us, including me. The Synod on the Amazon took place between the 6th and the 27th of December. This was the Synod of Bishops, a special assembly of the Synod of Bishops that was actually founded some 15 years ago. And every so often, the Holy Father will call together bishops to discuss matters of importance and urgency in the church. The most recent synod was on the Pan-Amazonia, and it was basically a gloss on Laudato Si, the papal encyclical on the environment, as it applies to the Amazonia, but it also was very much concerned with the problems of evangelization and the church in the Amazon. And we can start right there by understanding that 2/3 of the parish communities in the Amazon are headed by women. And The bishops of the Amazonia made this quite clear in their discussions, as I am told. The synod members who voted, there were 185 voters. 184 of them were bishops. One was a layman, a lay brother. How he got in is an interesting story. The International Union, the Union of Superiors General, which is the men's group of the heads of the men's religious orders and institutes around the world. The men's group nominated 10 of their members to participate, and a religious brother was nominated and accepted. So there were 184 bishops and one layman. Now there are also 33 women at the synod. And those 33 women, the International Union of Superiors General, the women's group representing the some 1,500 women's religious institutes and orders around the world, they also nominated 10 members. So they had 10 people there who were the heads of women's religious institutes and orders, but they were not permitted to vote. There were another 23 women there who were there as experts and auditors. But the bottom line is, and you must have heard noise about this, that women didn't have the vote. And I've written about this in my column. And on the one hand, I get it because it's a synod of bishops. On the other hand, I don't get it because abbesses and prioresses, at least historically, are the equivalent of bishops. And they actually had the same consecratory prayers in many cases as the bishops. In any event, for the 3 weeks, they discussed things. What did they discuss? They discussed, as you must have heard in the news, matters about ecology and matters about logging and farming and basically the rape of the earth. But the two money quotes were one about married priests and the other one was about women deacons. The married priests question came up in that the Synod Fathers at the end of the day actually requested permission to ordain married men as priests. And the document says that these married men will have served in the diaconate for a number of years. They have a stable family life, a stable marriage, and they would like them to be priests. Why? Well, in some of these parishes in the Amazon run by women, the Eucharist is available once a year. And all of the stories you hear about communion services and saving consecrated bread just doesn't work in the Amazon because it just doesn't keep, there are no refrigerators in the Amazon. So that was the big money quote. And that actually went forward as a request from the Synod Fathers. There were two items that had a significant, they were passed, but they had a significant amount of negative votes. One was the question about ordaining married men, and the other was sort of about maybe we think, gosh, wouldn't it be nice? Maybe we should think more about women deacons. Now, the document as it went in to the discussion, the original document, I am told, the draft document proposed women deacons for the Amazon flat out. 4 of the 12 language groups, there were 4 Portuguese language groups, 5 Spanish language groups, 2 Italian, and 1 mixed French and English. I understand the 4 Portuguese language groups, which would have been from the Brazilians, were very, very strong about requesting women as deacons. And 9 of the 12 language groups actually included women deacons in their discussion. But I'll read you paragraph 103, which is the operative paragraph. I'm reading from a working document. This is not the official translation. This is the working English translation that was given to the Synod, to the press last Saturday, October 26th. And it is the As I said, it's the unofficial. The official is online. If you can read Spanish, you can see the official. But paragraph 103 says, in the many consultations carried out in the Amazon Synod, the fundamental role of religious and lay women in the Church of the Amazon and its communities was recognized and emphasized, given the multiple services they provide. In a large number of these consultations, the permanent diaconate for women was requested. For this reason, the theme was important during the Synod. Already in 2016, Pope Francis had created a study commission on the diaconate of women, which as a commission arrived at a partial result based on what the reality of the diaconate of women was like in the early centuries of the Church and its implications for today. We would therefore like to share our experiences and reflections with the commission and await its results. Well, folks, the commission are us. Thank you. I heard it. I can't comment on the way the commission is characterized or anything because I'm still under papal secrecy. I can tell you that I don't know when we'll be recalled. In May 10th, 2018, just last May, the Holy Father met with the UISG at their triennial assembly, and he handed them a document. He said, here's the little they agreed on, and I plan to call them back shortly. Well, that was May 10th. It's now November 4th, and I just don't know what will happen. So that's as much as I know, but I also know that there were very, very strong discussions about restoring women to the diaconate. And I can tell you in terms of the outside the commission discussion, but in the general realm of academic discussion, the same conversation has been going on for 400 years. Those of you who have heard me speak, and I see a lot of names of folks that I've met over the course of the years, same conversation has been going on for 400 years. Women, there were definitely women deacons. We know there were women deacons. It's incontrovertible that there were women deacons east and west. We know that they were recognized by ceremony. We know that keratonia and keratonethia, being ordained and being blessed, those words are used interchangeably in all of the ceremonies for men and for women. We also know that in the 70s, the discussion about women deacons came up, and a man named Roger Grison said, yeah, they were ordained, they were full members of the diaconate. And 10 years later, Aimé Georges Marie-Mort said, no, they weren't. And that's the same conversation that went on in the 17th century. Jean Morin said, yes, they were ordained. In the 18th century, Jean Pien said, no, they weren't. I find it interesting as I speak to you that it's always the first person to speak is, yes, women were ordained. And then it takes a while, 100 years in the case of Jean Pien and 10 years in the case of Marie-Mort, to say, no, they weren't. So, but then again, the question is, and I had this question when I spoke at Boston College last month or in September, you know, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a difference if they were ordained, and it makes a difference if they weren't ordained. If you can prove that they definitely were not sacramentally ordained, that the bishop had no intent to ordain this woman a deacon, then you can argue, well, then there's no history. But again, if you're using the same ceremonies, I was just reading about the ceremonies today in Gary Macy's fine book. If you're reading about, if you're thinking about the ceremonies, basically the same ceremonies were used for men and for women. And so when you have that going on, it's then disingenuous to say that the bishop really meant to ordain the man and really didn't mean to ordain the woman. So that's basically where it is. I think that the conversation will continue. What I did find interesting, and I'm not sure I have the exact number in front of me, but what I did find interesting is that there is a paragraph here, paragraph 95. It's urgent for the Church in the Amazon to promote and confirm ministries for men and women in an equitable manner. Now, I am told that that means acolyte and lector for men and for women. If you remember in 2008, the Synod in 2008 voted positively to have women installed permanently as lectors. It's a lay ministry. And nothing happened because the documentation went to the Pope and that's where it went. So that's where we are. I don't know what will happen next. I think that it's important to continue the discussion and to continue praying and thinking about this. But I can tell you that the people in the Amazonian Synod were very, very interested in women deacons. So, Colleen, do you have questions?
I do, Phyllis. Well, a couple of questions there on the commission just got knocked off by what you said. But the Pope talks about adding new people to the commission. Do you have any idea if that would help work out the male-female balance on the commission, or any ideas on who they are? You said you don't have any idea of when the commission will meet or anything along those lines.
Well, what Cardinal Czerny said at the press conference, and if you're really interested in this, I advise you to search for the final press conference, because Czerny is a Canadian Jesuit, a brand new cardinal, and he was secretary to the commission, and he actually is Paolo Ruffini who put in he's the head of Vatican communication. He put in the details. What I understand is that 3 people will be joining, 2 women, 1 a religious and 1 man. And I didn't catch whether that man was a cleric or not. In terms of the original composition of the commission, it was 6 women, 6 men, and the president of the commission was Cardinal Adaria. So I guess that's 7 and 6. And if you add 2, it'd be 8 and 8. 2 and 1 would be 8 and 8.
Great, that's great. So a couple of questions are coming in now, Phyllis, and I have a whole list that have come in. But you talked about really the difference it makes that we recognize that women were ordained deacons. And so one of the questions that just came in the chat room is, how long ago were the last ordained women deacons activated and active in the church? What's the timeline on that?
Well, in the Orthodox Church, I'd say now, but in the Western tradition, in the Latin Church, we have Bishop Ottone of Lucca ordaining women in the 12th century. So, and we we don't have many more details than that. We know that there were repeated arguments against, well, not only against ordaining women, but against women even at the altar, and starting very early in the 5th century, but we know until the 12th century at least. Then you have the famous ones, Heloise in Abelard and Heloise in the 11th century. So we know they were there until the early Middle Ages. So.
Phyllis, one of the questions that came in is, do you think ordaining women as deacons would be a worldwide movement, or would it just be in the Amazon?
Well, what happens to something like this? It has to be a permission that can be granted, if that makes any sense. Let me use the example of the men, married men. An ordained man cannot get married, but a married man can be ordained. In order to allow a married man to be ordained a priest, you have to ask for a derogation from the law, a waiver. And we see that in the United States with the many Anglican Episcopalian priests who are ordained as Catholic priests in the United States. Actually, in the United States, the first first married man ordained, I think was Methodist in 1929. So that becomes a derogation from the law, and it's granted at various levels. And right now, it would seem it would be on a case-by-case basis that people would be ordained. So the requests would be coming right now from the Amazonia. The Holy Father could give a permission from the Amazonia. He could allow the Episcopal conferences in the Amazonia or individual bishops on their own accord to make that determination. But there's, I guess what I'm saying is, he has very often said, if you want to ordain married men, ask me. So if the Episcopal Conference in Canada asked him, I can't see why he wouldn't respond as well. It becomes a case-by-case basis, actually, in the long run. On the point of women deacons, I'm told by canon lawyers that it's a merely ecclesiastical law. That is, and that's technical term, Canon 85 says that the competent authority can grant a waiver or derogation from a, quote, merely ecclesiastical law, because the diaconate is not the priesthood. Now, having said that, it would seem that for the Amazonia, he could also say ad experimentum, as an experiment, we can allow women deacons in the Amazonia and see how it is. But I can't imagine how bishops in other territories, and certainly men I've talked to from Africa and Canada and parts of the United States would be jumping on board and asking for that permission as well. So you just don't know. Can I just ask folks to use the private chat when you're asking questions, because it's kind of distracting to me.
Then that's easy enough. As you click on the chat, instead of clicking to everyone, you can click right to me, Colleen Gibson, and I'll take those questions. And you touched on some of this, but I'll touch on some of those questions that are in the chat right now, Phyllis. And so one of the questions is talking about Cardinal Ladaria at the CDF, and there's a sense that he is in opposition to women deacons, and that nothing will happen unless the CDF prefect changes. Do you have any comments or any sense of that?
No.
And then one of the other questions that came is a question about the sentiment among U.S. bishops. And you said about what the willingness would be in the United States. You know, as we talk about these different regions, what would need to happen to move the case forward among U.S. bishops for female diaconate?
Well, with some of them, you'd have to put a firecracker under them, but other of them are ready today. You know, it just depends on their pastoral needs and their pastoral sensibilities. I asked a American cardinal this in Rome one day. I said, you know, if we get women deacons, what will happen in the United States? He said, no American bishop will say no. And I said, when I named a diocese, he said, well, that's not on this planet, but most dioceses, most diocesan bishops, I think, would recognize that it would be at their peril to speak against women. See, I think what the Amazon Synod pointed out is that women are the backbone of the church, and even in the Instrumentum Laboris, in the working document, women were mentioned 29 times. And it wasn't just we need women as ministers. It was, you know, we need to address the problems of violence against women, of being excluded, of women being trafficked, of women being raped, you know. And I think that if you think back to how the discussion began in 2015, when Paul-André Durocher from Gatineau in Quebec, in Canada, when Bishop Durocher brought it up, he said the reason, a reason for women deacons was the violence against women. And I say this all the time, you know, until the church has women standing vested in St. Peter's proclaiming the gospel, it has no right to argue for the equality of men and women. I mean, it just doesn't. You look, and I've been in the Basilica for these events, and it's a wall of men, What is that saying to the world? It looks like an assembly in Saudi Arabia with different kinds of outfits. So I think that the United States is coming around. There are various initiatives that are going on. There's an organization called Future Church, which is headquartered in the Midwest, that has a wonderful initiative about ad limina visits. And on their website, which I've had the opportunity to look at, they have the dates of the ad limina visits. An ad limina visit is it's supposed to be every 5 years. The US bishops are now getting their every 7 or 8 year visits. But the bishops of a diocese, including the auxiliary bishops, go to the throne, to the limit of the throne, and they go around and give reports to the various equestries, and they also have a meeting with the Pope. I can tell you that Region 1, New York, is on the plane, I think, Thursday night this week, and their ad limina visit will be all of next week. But the Future Church initiative is to write letters to the editor of newspapers, to contact the bishops, and to write op-eds in order to perhaps let them know what people think about women deacons and other issues, whatever issues are of interest. I don't know that mixing women priests and women deacons is a good idea. In fact, I think it's not a good idea. The historical evidence is quite prevalent for women deacons, and actually the day the document was released, the Synod document was released, was the 10th anniversary of a document called Omnium in Mentum, which Benedict XVI released. And that particular document clearly delineated the difference between the diaconate, which is, or the deacons which are ordained for ministry, and the presbyterate and the episcopacy. And of course, the day that a bishop, Brazilian bishop, mentioned that, immediately Archbishop Ganswein, who is the personal secretary to Pope Benedict the 16th, former Pope Benedict, came out and said, "Oh no, Pope Benedict said he didn't mean that. It didn't mean women deacons." Well, 10 years ago, I had an article in the Tablet in London saying inching toward yes. I mean, I was told many years ago by a very brilliant woman who was the senior woman in the Vatican at the time, that they can't say no. They just don't want to say yes, which would probably give the answer to any of the objecting cardinals or bishops that you could name or not name.
Phyllis, do you have a sense, has any research been done about what the public opinion is about the female diaconate, and what perhaps the response of the laity, especially in the United States, would be?
Yeah, I have an article called interestingly enough, what do U.S. Catholics think about women deacons? It's in the, here it is. It's in the Review of Religion Research in September of this year. And I co-wrote it with a Jesuit sociologist, Eric Barelza. And basically it's a report of 3 studies, 2 professional studies done by CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, and 1 online study that was published in the magazine U.S. Catholic. This article can be downloaded from my website if you're interested in it. It's kind of sociological, but it does have the numbers if they would be useful to you. Basically, about 75% of everybody surveyed said, yeah, of course, we need women deacons. One of the surveys was of the heads of men's and women's religious institutes and orders, and they were extremely positive. And I find that very interesting because it was across the board. And as you may know, for both the men and the women, there's a great distribution of, I hate to say right and left, but a great distribution of interest among these. But all of them said yes. The other survey for America Magazine was of women, and they were like, sure. And the third survey was a general survey done by US Catholic, which some right-wing bloggers tried to disrupt, but even in their disruption, it still came out, I think, 79% positive for women deacons. There was another study done by CARA, and that study was the attitudes of bishops in the United States and of deacon directors. And they basically said they didn't think it was going to happen, but if it did, they could use the women deacons. So that's the interest. That those studies are not included in my article. What do U.S. Catholics think about women deacons? Which, as I said, is on the website.
Right. Yeah, and I'm gonna, if you look in the chat box right now, there's a link there to the document on your page, Phyllis, and if I can get it up before the end of our time together, I'll try to get the CARA study and that into the chat box so people will have links to it. A question, you talked a little bit about oftentimes the female priesthood and female diaconate are tied together, and there were a couple of questions that came in along the lines of that. And so one of the questions was, does pursuing a female diaconate, in your mind, does it settle for something short of priesthood, or do you think having a female diaconate would negate the pursuit of the priesthood for women?
Well, I don't think so. In fact, I think part of the fear of women deacons is that in the mind's eye of the world, well, everybody's a deacon before he is a priest. And that is the case today. It didn't happen to be that way. And in fact, the true work of the diaconate is the deacon reports to the bishop. I mean, that's basically the way it goes, and the priest reports to the bishop. So while we have a tradition of men being ordained as deacons before they're ordained as priests, that really is what's caused part of the problem. In the 10th, 11th century, we have the Gregorian reform, the great changes of Gregory VII. And one of them was Gregory was actually not, he was the penultimate deacon elected Bishop of Rome. There were 37 of them. He was the 36th, but he insisted on being made a priest before he was made a deacon. And he really solidified what's called the cursus honorum. The man on the road to priesthood is tonsured and then made a porter, an elector, an exorcist, an acolyte, these minor orders which were ordained in the sacristy typically, and then ordained to the major order of subdeacon and then deacon and priest. But at the time of the Gregorian reform and the decretals of Gresham, no one could be ordained a deacon unless he was destined to become a priest. And that's really when the female diaconate died out. Female diaconate lasted longer as a standalone ministry, but it began to die out in the 11th century. And as I said, Ottone of Lucca was the last bishop I know of in the West, in Italy, to have ordained women as deacons. See, because the law said you couldn't ordain anybody a deacon unless that person was expected to be a priest. That ended with Vatican II and the documents after Vatican II, particularly the documents that suppressed the minor orders and replaced those minor orders with the installed orders, the lay ministries of lector and acolyte, which this document, the synod document that I have here, which this document asked for, or which the synod asked for, to install men and women equally in these lay ministries, and also the suppression of the major order of the subdiaconate and the erection of the diaconate as a ministry, or the recognition of the diaconate as a ministry of its own accord, an ordained ministry of its own accord. That's why the Omnium Inventum, the document of Benedict XVI, 10 years ago, October 26, is so important because it really does codify what was already in the Catechism in 1983, which was already in Vatican II documents, that the diaconate is not the priesthood. Yes, I think in the mind's eye of the world, there would be more discussion, but it's a different kind of discussion, a different level of discussion. And I don't have I never did the work. I never really studied priesthood, and I don't find that there is as convincing documentation for the ordination of women as priests as there is for ordination of women as deacons. It's not to say that women did not perform priestly functions. I think that's a separate issue because some of the functions, and this is in my next book, some of the functions that we see as priestly functions are functions that were allowed to be performed by deacons. They were juridically authorized by the bishop to be performed by deacons, such as confession, such as anointing. And we have a great history of women anointing and a great history of women offering confession. And then it's really not until the 16th century that you find that deacons are cut out permanently from hearing confession, not able to receive the juridical authority from the bishop. Anyway,
Phyllis, thank you for that. I think it's really clarifying to say, that the diaconate was laid out as a ministry of its own accord. And so to make that distinction and to talk about that, you brought up towards the end there your response about function. And one of the questions that came in via email, and I'll read a chunk of it here. The questioner says, for years, deacon friends have tried to explain to me that the function of a female deacon was completely different than that of a male. Beginning, it was meant as a defense of the status quo, since the role of helping naked women in baptism by immersion is no longer needed, I guess. I responded that there are plenty of other words which could have been chosen for the role that the women were playing, if it were so unlike the deacons. So in the current discussion, has there been any indication that the role or the function of deacon served by women would be limited to, for example, only working with women, or if it would be the function would be more expansive? Has there been any discussion about that?
Well, I can't talk about the commission, and outside, I think what I write about and talk about is the full order of the diaconate. Now, and what brings to mind is about I don't know when it was, maybe 10 years ago. I debated Sarah Butler in St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. It comes to mind since today is the feast of St. Charles Borromeo. And she said, oh, women deacons only ministered to women. I said, well, who ministers to women today? I think it's, first of all, it's not true. But secondly, it is true. It's true in the sense that women deacons anointed ill women. And Danielou opines that this was a sacramental anointing. Women deacons brought the Eucharist to their homes. You wouldn't send a man into the home of an ill woman. But women deacons also preached, we know that. Women deacons assisted in baptism, where the bishop and a male deacon was involved in the baptism of a woman. They were not involved in anointing. The bishop would anoint the head of the woman. But the full body anointing would be done by a woman, and the woman deacon would receive the woman after the baptism. Now we're talking about, and it wasn't naked baptisms. I mean, they were covered many times covered by a kind of a veil or a sheath or some kind of a slip, we would call in today's times. But if they were naked, they were naked. I translated some documents and had the darndest time trying to understand what was going on in this one document. It was explaining a liturgy. And finally, we figured out that everything, all the action was going on the other side of a curtain that was set up next to the baptismal pool. And at the appropriate time, the bishop would just stick his arm in and wave it around and bless the woman. So, but yeah, the naked baptism trope, it has been around there. Pope Francis, when he first accepted the request in 2016 of the UISG to have a commission on women deacons, he said he remembered a Syrian scholar saying that when a woman accused her husband of beating her, he would ask the woman to go to the woman deacon, who would examine the bruises and then testify to the bishop. And it stuck in his head, and I'd never heard it before, but it really makes ultimate sense. This is more than just a ministry to women, get them baptized and then leave them to the men. That's not what happened. Women deacons catechized women and children. Certainly they kept order in the women's part of the assembly. They preached to women, and within monasteries they preached as well. The question today is, would their ministry be limited to women? And I would ask any man who says that, fine. If you want the ministry of women deacons to be limited to women, then the next time you go into or carted into an emergency room and the emergency room doctor is a female, then you should not be treated by her. If that is your prejudice, you should not be treated. You should never see a female dentist. You should never see a female psychologist. You should never see a female teacher. And boy, God help you if you ever stop by a female cop. I mean, we are in the 20th century here, 21st century, and there's no need to saddle ourselves with these kinds of restrictions. Somebody said this to me the other day, that they would really find it beneficial if there was a female presence in a parish, a female diaconal presence in a parish that people could go to, people could go to speak to, that they knew these people were part of the parish, they worked for the parish, and they're representative of the bishop's ministry. So anybody who has that kind of a problem, let them have the problem.
Mm-hmm. You brought up there towards the end, this distinction of administrative role of women and sacramental role of women. We had a couple of questions along those lines. And one of them is, just basic. How could there be a more balanced form of governance in the church? Are there conversations going on around that topic of having women in more administrative roles, and that the tie of, what a deacon would be able to do in the church versus a lay person?
Well, the canonical restrictions, I can't think of the number of the canon, but the wording was accepted when the Code of Canon Law was revised in 1983. It was accepted with the exception of one comma from a canon presented by then Cardinal Ratzinger, which said that basically lay people could not share governance, period. And to unravel all of that in canon law, I think is harder than getting women ordained as deacons, because then the deacon is the cleric, and the deacon as cleric can have certain not necessarily jurisdiction, but at least governance abilities delegated to them. For example, there's back and forth in terms of canonical trials, whether the bishop delegates his authority in the rendering of nullity of an annulment proceeding. With the new procedures now about 2 years old for annulments, a single judge can render this judgment of nullity on behalf of the bishop, but that single judge must be a cleric. So if a woman has taken the case and the woman has gone through the case, she cannot sign it. She has to go down the hall and get a cleric to sign it. And so that would be a way of women having more participation in the governance of the church. Clearly, the discussion about preaching is wide and far. But technically, the only person who can preach is the celebrant of the Mass, who can delegate it to another cleric who participates in the Mass. I like to tell people this because it drives me crazy when, Father visiting missionary comes in out of the wings at every single Mass and preaches at Masses he is not participating in. It's totally illegal, and it kind of bothers me a little bit. The only exception is in 1997 rules where someone who is better able to speak to children can deliver they don't quite call it a homily, but can speak after the gospel to the children. And that, of course, redounds to the fact of men or women who are grade school teachers or some people are better able to speak to children. And some of those people may be lay people. But I think, one of the things in the Amazonian Synod recommendations was an office called Woman Leader of Community, which at first made me a little crazy, but thinking about it, that's an office. It would be a lay ministry, creating perhaps a new lay ministry. Much like what we have in the United States, pastoral life coordinator. One doesn't necessarily have to be a deacon to be a pastoral life coordinator. They already have 2/3, as I said earlier, of the parishes in the Amazonia run by women, so maybe they're going to give them some kind of a title. But the fact of an office being a parish life coordinator it is equally available to a deacon and to a lay person. In the United States, there are 341 parish life coordinators in the country. I don't have the numbers on how many of them are deacons, but they're male and female religious, male and female lay people and deacons. So,
and I think, as you pointed out, it came up in the midst of really the press conferences as the synod was going on. Women religious speaking about hearing what in essence was confession, not being able to offer absolution, but that pastoral presence. And there's a couple of people here in the chat who are talking about, there are women religious serving in parishes and lay women and lay men working in parishes who offer advice and prayer and answer questions on scripture and do the work of Jesus. And so to know that that's going on, but the movement towards a sacramental role would make a big difference in giving authority and giving a place at the table, so to say.
Well, this is it. And although also, people think about the administrative roles. When I met with sisters at the United Nations who were their NGOs from their institutes and orders, but they were 5 or 6 sisters who had worked or were from every single continent you could think of. I mean, and they had been in India, they'd been in Africa, they'd been in South America, they'd been in the United States and Canada too. And they said almost to a woman that aside from the fact that, particularly the Indian sister I recall, she said if she were ordained, she felt that the men would just have, the priests would have more respect for her, first of all. But that they didn't necessarily want to run the show, but they wanted to be able to baptize and marry folks, because in South America, for example, everybody was going next door to the Pentecostals. And to be able to have that kind of a presence. Teva Regule is a Greek Orthodox scholar. She's at MIT, and she has a wonderful online discussion about the presence that an ordained woman would bring. And clearly this is much the same as the presence of a woman religious, a male religious, or any other lay minister who is secular. But the fact of ordination, I think, well, put it this way, if it didn't mean so much, why would they be so upset about it? What is it about ordination that makes so many men get their cassocks in a knot? And I think that the fact of the matter is that in Inter and Signores in 1976, there was about the priesthood, there was the argument that a woman, the iconic argument, a woman could not image Christ. Now that argument was dropped in 1994 from Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. Both of those documents clearly said nothing about the diaconate, and one of them, Cotier, the secretary of the ITC, said that the diaconate was specifically left aside. This has been continual over the discussion of ordination of women, that the diaconate is specifically left aside because, as I said earlier, they can't say no. They just don't want to say yes. But in the 2002 document about the diaconate, which is a whole other story that I can go into another time, but in the 2002 document about the diaconate, there's an attempt to resurrect the iconic argument that a woman cannot image Christ. And in fact, they invent a new term about deacons, saying that they are in persona Christi servi. And of course, the in persona Christi part is the part that women can't do. Well, here's a news flash, that's heretical. We're all made the image and likeness of God. We all image the risen Lord. In fact, that's the title of my next book, Women Icons of Christ. The in persona Christi Capitis Ecclesiae is really to your point here, and that's Christ, the head of the church, and governing and administrative functions. And there's a whole German school of thought about that, about Voros, the standing before, that only the man can stand before the church in the image of Christ, which has been debunked quite strongly by major scholars. But anyway, that's probably too much in the weeds here.
It's fine. We'll move our way back out of the weeds. These next set of questions may move us further into it. There are a couple of questions that came in, Phyllis, about qualifications. If when women are ordained, or if women are ordained, what would be the qualifications that would be needed? Would age have a bearing on it? Would the same conditions for the diaconate that apply to men apply to women? Is that clear if in that way? And then what background or preparation would a candidate have to have to be eligible to be ordained a deacon?
Well, it depends on the vocation to the diaconate. I tell you, the first people who are denied entry to the diaconal formation program today are the fellows who say, well, I'm married, so I can't be a priest, so I want to be a deacon. It's really a call to the vocation to service, to the word, the liturgy, and charity. Right now, in terms of men, celibates, presumably people who belong to religious institutes, can be ordained as deacons at the age of 25. Individuals who are married, the age is 35. With the permission of their spouses, and actually the children sometimes get involved. Most of the programs I've seen, you have to enter the program so you can be ordained before you're 65, which is interesting because one document I saw just today said you had to be, for a woman, at least 60 to be ordained. So, which is kind of an interesting way in the early church to cut women out. If you have to be 60 to be ordained, I'm sure there weren't a lot of them around. But I think that the same directory of formation for the diaconate would be applicable. There's one generally in the United States, and then each diocese has its own programs. And I mean, and it's been uneven. I mean, face it, some dioceses have a lot of great deacons and some just don't. I had this conversation just the other day in Toronto, for example. You're ordained a deacon with your parish assignment, but you also have to have another assignment. For example, if in the parish you are in charge of the charitable ministries of the parish, that's your other assignment. But the parish assignment for your sacramental ministry. But if your sacramental ministry is in the parish, then you would also be assigned to a prison ministry, a hospital ministry. In some, it becomes a little crass, but in some respects, I think it is a question of, it's another job qualification. Um, but as I say to many bishops, look, you either train, ordain, and give faculties to the women who work for you, or you don't. I mean, it's as simple as that. You either know what their training is, or you don't. The qualifications would be basically the same, but as I said, would vary. A bishop can do what he wants. A bishop can ordain a priest, actually, dispensing him of going to seminary, or at least going to a Catholic seminary, which is what they do when they ordain Episcopalians, because they haven't gone to Catholic seminaries. So we're going to run out of time soon. So do you have more questions here?
I just have a couple. One that came in as we were talking before about administrative roles and sacramental roles was about, this is a quick one-off, but are deacons paid for their services? It's a ministry of service. Are they paid? Are they compensated in some way? Are they salaried?
Yeah, yes and no. A deacon who runs the catechetical program may or may not be salaried. The deacon who is the pastoral life coordinator, I would think, would be salaried. The deacon who is the chaplain at a hospital could be either a volunteer or paid. You have to have CPE training, 4 units of CPE training to get yourself hired by a hospital. But many hospitals have deacons hired. So it depends. There's an interesting, and I'd have to study the document more, but there is an interesting kind of suggestion in the Amazonia document that the bishop would support the deacon. But right now in the United States, at least, the deacon is not owed stole fees, nor is the deacon salaried. And that's a problem, because they turn into what one bishop derisively called Sunday dress-up guys. All they do is show up on the altar for a mass on Sunday, and then they go back selling aluminum siding or whatever they do during the week. And it's kind of a disjunctive kind of thing. I met a deacon recently, and after the mass, I said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "I'm a deacon." I said, "I know, but what is your work?" He says, "I'm an accountant." I was like, so.
One last question, I think, to kind of round us out, Phyllis, as our time is coming to an end. One of the questioners talked about Pope Francis, and that, he's been more open to dialoguing, to conversation, and to kind of even taking the risk of having these conversations. But it seems it's unclear what he'd like. And so the question was, do you think he's offering a sign of hope, or do you think it's a sign of indecision? And then the follow-up question, what's your hope in the midst of all of this? What continues to give you hope?
Well, what continues to give me hope is that I'm not in charge. I think the Holy Spirit's in charge. And in terms of the Holy Father, I find him a man of deep prayer and of genuine and honest discernment. And I know what I want. I want what the church needs. And if the church itself voices its need, as it has in the Amazonia, if it has the need for women as deacons, I think it will get women as deacons. That's the church will not be denied what it needs. The church will have the opportunity to flourish and grow only if it's open to the promptings of the Spirit, as she blows her grace through the world.
I think that's hopeful, that we can offer the church what the church most needs. And so I'd like to thank you, Phyllis. We've come to the end of our hour. Thank you so much for the enlightening discussion and for all of your input. And is there anything else you'd like to offer?
You know what? I just thought of this. I have to make a little commercial. When we were in two things. First of all, we have on my website, there are what's that? On my website, we have free download for various study guides, which were done by Sisters Donna Ciangio and Sandy Damazzi in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. They did the English and we had them translated. The book, Women Deacons Past, Present, Future, is available now in those 4 languages. We also have, and I haven't seen it yet, but I think Voice of the Faithful is going to load what we've called elevator speech cards, which happen to have been done in Rome and were passed out all over Rome in 6 different languages, in German, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And we also have them in Japanese, but we're trying to get that proofread. And these are little cards that give, on the one side, the facts about the ordination ceremony for a women deacon, and then the other side, the argument for women deacons. Basically, if the same as in Lumen Gentium, the same as in the discussion about male deacons, there are people doing the work of the diaconate already, and they should be strengthened by the grace and charism of order. And the diaconate is not the priesthood, and women can image Christ.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phyllis. And there are links in the group chat to the study guide that you mentioned and to Phyllis's website so that you can get more information. You can see past webinars. And as we said, a video copy of this webinar will go up soon at some point. So thank you so much, Phyllis. Thank you all for taking the time and for being here, and get out there and advocate on behalf of this.
Thank you.
Have a good night.